Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of We Talk History. I'm your host, Jordan Pope. Today, we're going to be talking about the Patriot War, and specifically the Windsor campaign of that war in 1838. But first, before I begin, I kind of wanted to talk about my writer's craft trip that I discussed briefly in the previous episode. For anybody that wasn't listening, I had the opportunity to speak to some veterans of the Second World War, Korean War, and other various conflicts that Canada was involved in. And so it's right up my alley. Obviously, I'm quite interested in history, so I got to speak to a man named Warrant Officer John Naduk, and he had some very interesting stories about his contributions to Canadian operations in Bosnia, in Namibia, in Afghanistan, mostly in Afghanistan. That's what he was talking about for the majority of the conversation, and he was talking about his relationship with the local population in Afghanistan, dealing with the Taliban insurgents that he fought, and it was very cool to hear those stories from someone that's actually experienced it. You know, most of these stories we see on television or in movies or even in the classroom when we're learning about war and all these different conflicts, but to actually hear something like this from someone that's been in the conflict, I think it was totally different and very cool, and I want to thank Warrant Officer Naduk for sharing his story and all the other veterans that contributed as well. I also talked to a gentleman who served in the Naval Reserve, still serves in the Naval Reserve, actually. He did a lot of missions on the two coasts of Canada. It was very interesting as well. Talked about what it's like to be in the Navy and how, what it's like, to basically manage a ship. So that was very cool as well. So I thought that was a very educational experience. I'm very thankful that I had the opportunity to talk to those gentlemen. And yeah, it was great. I would definitely do it again if I had the opportunity. So very productive. So like I said, anyways, back to the topic at hand. Today's conversation is going to be centered around the Patriot War. Now, I don't expect many of our listeners to know what the Patriot War was. I didn't know what it was even until I looked into it, because it's such a big part of our history here in Windsor and Essex County. So, all of us should know about the American Revolution. Basically, a bunch of people who wanted to become independent from Britain, that were living in the colonies, who wanted to govern themselves, independent from the crown, got together and they rebelled against their government. And after many years of fighting, they eventually won their independence and became the United States of America. Now, the Patriot War is similar in a way. A bunch of Canadian patriots, and Americans as well, wanted present-day Canada to be independent from Britain as well. At the time, this was 1837 or 1838. So, basically a secret society called Hunter's Lodge was formed in Vermont, and what the whole objective of this secret society was to basically make Canada, or the Canadian colonies, one republic independent from the crown, or basically forcing Britain out of North America, because obviously, as we know, after the British lost the Revolutionary War, present-day Canada was all that was left of British North America. Although there was a neutrality agreement signed after the war, the Revolutionary War between the United States and the British Empire, so it was kind of a strange situation. You would expect that the U.S. would support Hunter's Lodge and all these different people that wanted to overthrow the British government in Canada. But surprisingly, they stayed out of it. Actually, as a matter of fact, I believe they actually supported the British in this conflict when they were fighting in eastern Michigan and a bunch of other theaters in the war. So, although it might not be a very famous war or popular war discussed in history classes, I think it's very important to our identity, not just here in Windsor-Essex, but as a country as well, that we've had to deal with rebellion against the crown. And because even today we have the crown is so important. The British crown is so important to us, and the monarchy is still traditionally, like, the Queen is still our head of state. I just think that Britain is still a very, very important part of our Canadian identity, and the Patriot War should probably be discussed more in classes so we can gain an appreciation for that tradition. So, why are we talking about this? It's just another war. We've had many different conflicts here in North America and around the world that have involved Canada. But specifically, why we're going to talk about this one today is because right here in Windsor-Essex, we had to basically face that conflict firsthand. Now, before that happened, a bunch of people that formed Hunter's Lodge also formed a government on Navy Island called the Republic of Canada, the Canadian Republic. Obviously, it was an unrecognized state at the time. Nobody thought they were a real nation, but they did claim independence from Canada. And for about a year, or about 2 years, I should say, they were their own nation. Now, the whole objective of this conflict when they declared war against the British was to basically install a government, an independent government, a republic, between present-day Windsor and present-day Niagara. And I think they had the same objective in mind to just eventually become, to eventually make all of Canada independent from the Crown. But of course, that was going to take some time. But it was short-lived, obviously. We can all tell that they lost the war. The rebels did. So, and yeah, we've always, to this day, we've remained a part of the Crown. So let's actually talk about the conflict now. Let's talk about the real battles. The first and probably most notable battle involving our area was the Battle of Windsor. Yes, the battle was called the Battle of Windsor. It was a very short-lived campaign. It wasn't a very bloody battle at all. It was, we talk about all the bloody battles throughout history. The Battle of Normandy and all that. That was not. The Battle of Windsor was nothing like that. So it was centered around the eastern Michigan area in the United States and the present-day Windsor area and above Upper Canada. Now, a group of men on both sides, calling themselves Patriots, formed small militias in 1837 with the intention of seizing the southern Ontario Peninsula. So, when all of these rebellion leaders got together for a meeting in Detroit, they decided that they were going to basically take up arms against the British. So, the rebel leaders held these public meetings, organized an invasion force, and they seized 450 muskets from a Detroit jail. 450 muskets. That's quite unbelievable that it was that easy to obtain that many weapons for an invasion this size. You would have thought that the Americans were able to defend those arms because, wow, it's just quite unbelievable they were able to have access to that. You could never picture that in the present day, I must say. I mean, if someone went to a Detroit jail or a bunch of leaders got together and prepared a force and they raided a Detroit jail for weapons, they would never get away with it. So obviously they didn't have that kind of security back then, but it's just hard to believe and just quite crazy in my opinion. Now, after they gathered all of these weapons, it was time for Hunter's Lodge and the Republic of Canada to take on the British forces and American forces in that region. So they got on a schooner called Anne on January 8th of that year and sailed to Gibraltar, Michigan. Now, the governor at that time, Stevens T. Mason, along with a detachment of 200 militiamen, pursued them in 2 steamships. 100 Canadian militia also followed in the steamer Alliance. Now, Governor Mason met with the Patriot leaders at Gibraltar, but captured the steamship Anne and continued on to Fort Malden on the Canadian shore. Now, I've talked about Fort Malden in the previous episodes. It's still standing today, and it's very cool to hear that they are actually a part of this battle. Now, on January 9th, the Patriots began shelling Fort Malden and the town of Amherstburg from the Anne. The Canadian militia took up positions in the town, while the Patriots moved 300 men onto the Canadian Bois Blanc Island, so that's Boblo Island today, opposite the town. The Canadian militia opened fire on the schooner when it tried to reach the island. The Canadians shot several of the ship crew and damaged the sails and rigging, so there were casualties in this battle. This ship actually drifted until it ran aground, at which point the Canadian militia boarded it, encountered no resistance, and captured the Patriot crew. So really the forces here dealing with the rebels, they had no problem overtaking their ship. Now, the remaining forces of the Patriot army there basically fled for safety on the American side of the river. Now, after losing the Anne, which was the ship that the Patriots had used, they decided to steal another ship, and this was called Little Erie. The head of the Detroit militia himself tried to prevent the boat from leaving at Sword Point, and the U.S. Marshals Force was reported to have fired into the air, but the local crowd supported the Patriot movement, and the boat was taken to Gibraltar. So, imagine that. You're the head of this Detroit militia force, and you're trying to take back this ship that the Patriots have basically stolen, and the entire local population there, or the great majority of it, just sat around doing nothing and allowed the Patriot forces to do that. Now, again, that probably, wouldn't happen in the present day. If any kind of, I guess they're pirates. If any pirates try to steal this ship, steal a ship in our waters today, this would never happen. So it's pretty crazy that happened. And it's actually surprising, another side point here, that so many people supported the Patriot movement. I mean, you would think that a lot of those people would just support the occupying force and listen to the U.S. Marshals Force, but they didn't. They basically sat around doing nothing, and it's just very surprising and problematic there. So obviously not a very good relationship there between the government and the people at that time. Very tense. Anyways, on January 27th, 3 companies of U.S. troops arrived from Buffalo aboard the steamer Robert Fulton to help calm the area, because obviously, like I said, there was a lot of tension here. Governor Mason met with the Patriots at Gibraltar on February 12th, again to no avail. On that same day, the Patriots raided the U.S. arsenal in Dearborn, Michigan, stealing hundreds of weapons. This group of weapons was soon recovered, having been hidden near a tavern in Detroit. It's surprising to me that the U.S. was having such a hard time with the Patriots stealing all these weapons and these supplies and stuff. You think that they'd be able to do a better job at basically protecting their resources, and that's probably a big reason why this conflict took place in the first place, because the access to weapons, the resources used in war was so easy to get access. So, like I said, the Battle of Windsor, there were a few casualties. Ultimately, the insurgency or the rebels were put down. The British and American forces had no problem handling those people. And again, it was a government victory at that battle in Windsor. But again, pretty crazy to think that in the Detroit River and in the town of Amherstburg and Dearborn, Michigan, and all these other areas, that we were fighting battles. Only 170 years ago, approximately that much time ago, that we were fighting battles in this area. That was just the norm. It's quite interesting. But that wasn't the only battle in our area. In Windsor, we had that, but we also had a smaller conflict that took place at the Battle of Pelee Island. And this is actually very interesting, because the battle didn't actually take place on the island. It took place during the winter on the ice that was frozen of Lake Erie. So imagine that. they're not even fighting on the island. They're not fighting on the shore or anything. They're actually fighting on the water or the frozen ice of Lake Erie. That's quite mind-boggling. But yeah, about 300 Canadian and American patriots under the command of a man named Major Lester Hoadley were trying to take Pelee Island. That was their objective from the government forces. Now, this prompted British Colonel John Maitland to send a force to recapture the island and secure it from further attack. So it sounds like a lot of a good portion of this war was probably spent having the British come and take these islands and the Americans come and take these islands back after they've been captured. It's just a lot of back and forth possession of land and stuff like that. Really, probably a big pain for the British and American forces. Now, Maitland sent Major George Brown with 126 men, compromising 2 companies of the British 32nd Regiment, and a detachment of the Canadian St. Thomas Volunteer Cavalry to cut off the invaders. So now I'm not saying the British were desperate here, the Canadian forces were desperate, but now they have to use their volunteer forces as well. Their irregulars sounded like they were having some difficulty with this conflict, so that's very interesting as well. This was no small conflict. Now, on March 3rd of 1838, Major Brown's forces intercepted the Hunter Patriots on the ice off the southwestern shore of the island and defeated them in a sharp fight. So probably a close quarters infantry combat right there. Not a lot of casualties, only 5 British and Canadian soldiers were killed, and there were 25 wounded. And those were the 2 major battles that occurred in the area. I mean, the war was fought all over Upper Canada, some places in Lower Canada as well. But those were the 2 major battles in the Windsor-Essex area. It only lasted about 2 years, in between the beginning of 1837 and the end of 1838. So, again, the government easily was able to put down the insurgency, but again, it's pretty crazy to think that we had, in our country, we had a force of people that were trying to overthrow the crown. And it makes you think, what would an alternate world look like? What would the present day what would an alternate Canada look like? Independent from the crown, if we were a republic like the United States. Is it possible that we'd merge with the United States into one country or something like that because of our shared ideology? Is our British identity what keeps us independent in the present day? There's a lot to think about. Very cool to reflect on that. So that's basically it for today. Just a very short and brief episode on the Patriot War. I want to thank you for listening. And I actually mentioned the American Revolution before, but I also have a suggestion for anybody that's into history and into television shows and all that stuff. There's a great show that I recently got into. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, called Turn, Washington Spies. And basically it's set in 1776 when the Americans were at war with the British, following Abraham Woodhull, who is recruited by the Patriot forces or the American forces in Setauket, New York, to spy on the British because he lives in a heavily occupied British territory. And essentially he was going to act as a spy. And in this conflict, actually, the American Revolutionary War, spies on both sides helped the forces plan their attacks and secure their defenses and stuff like that. So, very great show. I suggest it. I definitely recommend it. If you're interested in history, and I definitely encourage all listeners to read into the Patriot War, because, we've talked about it briefly today, but in my research and everything, I learned a lot more about Canadian identity and really just gained a whole new appreciation for the Crown. And it's just, I'm very proud to be a Canadian. I'm very proud of our history and our connections to the British monarchy, even in the present day today. And I think that we should defend tradition, and we should also defend our identity. So that's all for today. I want to thank you for listening. I'm unsure of what the next topic is going to be for our 4th episode, but stay tuned and thank you for listening.